Good morning, Math 11 students. Today our lesson is going to be on multiplying and dividing rational expressions. So when we're going to multiply, these are the steps that you need to take. Step number 1 is to factor numerator and denominator. Step 2 is to state your restriction, and you only state your restriction on your denominator only. Step 3, you multiply your numerators together. Step 4, you multiply your denominators together. And step 5, you cancel out any common factors. And this is called reduce. I'm going to do 3 examples with you on multiplying, and then we will move on to dividing. Example 1, write each product in simplest form. We're going to start off with a couple of simpler questions and get into a little bit more complicated. So if you look at our first question, our first step was to factor the numerators and factor the denominators. If I look here, my numerator is already factored. So nothing can be factored. So my step 1 is already done. Second step is to state my restriction, and the restriction is only on the denominator. If I look at my first denominator, it's a 3. There's no variable, therefore there is no restriction. My second denominator, it has an x squared. This is a monomial. Anytime you have a monomial, that means your restriction is going to be x cannot equal 0. Sorry, getting a new pen. X cannot equal 0. So I factored, everything was in factored form, then I stated my restriction, and now my next step is to multiply my numerators. When I multiply my numerators, I multiply the coefficients together. 4 times 5 gives me 20. Then my variables together, so I get wy divided by. Then 3 times 2 is 6, and x squared. So now I've multiplied my numerators together and I multiplied my denominators together. My last step is to reduce. When I reduce, I look at my coefficients separately. 20 and 6, I can make that smaller by dividing by 2, which gives me 10 and 3. And then I look here, I have a w, there's no w, so w stays. I have a y, there's no y, so the y stays. I have an x, there's no x too. So my final answer is 10wy over 3x squared with the restriction of x cannot equal 0. You have to show me your restriction. Restrictions are very, very, very important. Our second example is 3n plus 9 over 4n multiplied by 16n squared over n plus 3. So first step again is to factor numerators. If I look at top, I can factor that by taking out a GCF, which is 3, which leaves me with n plus 3. That's already factored. I can't do anything, so that stays as a 4n. Okay, that's my first bracket. And put a little dot for multiplying. 16n squared, I can't factor anything, so that stays as 16n squared. And then n plus 3 is also factors, so it stays as n plus 3. My second step is now to state my restriction. So I look at the denominator. Here it's a monomial, so my restriction is n does not equal 0. If I look here, I have a binomial. My binomial is n plus 3. So my restriction is always the number itself, but the opposite. So it's going to be n cannot equal negative 3. So those are my 2 restrictions for this question. My next step is now to multiply. When I'm multiplying, I can multiply my coefficients together, and I can multiply my binomials. But when we multiply binomials, you leave them in factored form. So I'm going to go 3 times 16, which gives me 48. And the n squared stays. And then I have n plus 3. I multiply my denominator, it's going to be 4n, because that's a monomial, times it with my binomial. So now I've multiplied my numerators, I've multiplied my denominators, and my next step is to reduce. when you reduce, you have to make sure you are canceling out binomials with binomials and monomials with monomials. So 48 divided by 4 gives me 12. N squared divided by n gives me n. And these two factors are identical, so they're going to cancel each other out. So your final answer is going to be 12n with the restriction of n cannot equal 0 and n cannot equal negative 3. So that is your final answer to this question. Okay. Our last example for multiplying, if you look at it, it looks a little bit more complicated. And if you look at it, you have to factor 4 times. So you have to be really, really good with your factoring. So step 1 is to factor. So if I look at the top, two numbers I multiply to give me negative 20 and add to give me negative 1 are x minus 5, x plus 4. On the bottom here, I can only take out a GCF of x, and I'm left with x minus 6. You times that. If I look at the other side, two numbers I multiply to give me positive 36 and add to give me negative 12 is x minus 6 and x minus 6. This whole thing is over. And two numbers I multiply to give me 20 and add to give me 9 are x plus 5 and x plus 4. Okay, so I factored the top and bottom. Now I have to state my restriction. If you look at here, you have two restrictions. I have a monomial, so x cannot equal 0. I have a binomial, x cannot equal positive 6. Here it would be negative 5, and there it would be negative 4. So I've stated my restrictions, and those are my restrictions. And now my next step is to multiply my numerators. When I multiply my numerators, I'm not foiling. I'm just putting them side by side. So my numerator now becomes x minus 5, x plus 4, x minus 6, x minus 6. The bottom becomes x, x minus 6, x plus 5, x plus 4. So I do not expand, I leave it exactly like this. So I multiply my numerators, I multiply my denominators, and now I get rid of any common factors. So I have x plus 4 here, x plus 4 here, so they cancel out. I have x minus 6 here, I have x minus 6, they cancel out. These two are not the same because that's x minus 5 and that's x plus 5. Nothing else I can cancel out. I'm left with x minus 5, x minus 6 over x, x plus 5. Okay, this is my final answer. And like I said, you do not have to expand your numerator or your denominator. You can leave everything in factored form, and then you have your restriction. When dividing, you take these steps. Step 1 is the same. You factor your numerator and denominator. Step 2 is different. You have to take the reciprocal of the second fraction, just like we did when we multiplied fractions. Step 3, you're going to state the restriction of the denominator of your first fraction and the entire second fraction. Step 4, you multiply your numerators together. Step 5, you multiply your denominators together. And step 6 is to reduce. I'm going to do 2 examples with you. Dividing is very similar to multiplying, just one extra step. Our first example. So, for example, our first step is to factor. I can factor the top by taking out a 4. So I have 4, then I have n minus 3. I can't do anything to the bottom, so that stays as n squared divided by. I can factor the top by taking out an 8. I'm left with n minus 3. And I can factor the bottom by taking out an n minus 2. So I factored my numerators, I factored my denominators. My next step, and this step is different. The first fraction stays exactly the same. Division becomes multiplication, and I flip. So it becomes n minus 2 over 8, n minus 3. Okay? Now I state my restriction. When I state my restriction, I state my restriction on the denominator of my first fraction. So I know n cannot equal 0. And I state the restriction on the entire fraction because at one point that was on the bottom and now this is on the bottom. So here I have a monomial, so it'll be 0 again. I don't have to write it twice. Here it would be positive 2 and here it would be positive 3. So those are my restrictions. Now I multiply. 4 times n gives me 4n. And my binomial stay exactly the same. Now here 8 times n squared gives me 8n squared. And my binomial stays the same. Remember, when you cancel, it's your binomial with your binomial and your monomial with your monomial. I have 4 over 8, which is the same thing as 1 over 2. I don't have to write the 1. This n gets canceled out with one of the n's here. So I'm left with n minus 2 on top. And on the bottom, 4 and 8 reduces to 2. And n and n gives you n. So that would be my final answer with this restriction. So this is our last example. First step is to factor the top, which gives me x plus 7, x plus 1. Factor the bottom, which gives me x minus 7, x plus 1. This is division. Factor the top, x plus 6, x plus 1. Factor the bottom is 6 and 7, x minus 7, x plus 6. Now I state my restriction. X cannot equal here 7 and negative 1. Here, negative 6 and negative 1. Here, 7 and negative 6. And I would just be repeating myself. So those are my restrictions. Now I'm dividing. I can't divide, so I flip. X plus 7, x plus 1. I flip. I'm just going to put it together. Saves me some time of rewriting. And x minus 7, x plus 1, and then the numerator. So it saves me some time so I don't have to write again. So I kind of flipped the fraction and multiplied at the same time. Now I cancel the x plus 7, none. The x plus 1, x plus 1, x minus 7, x minus 7, x plus 6, x plus 6. So those all cancel out. I'm left with x plus 7 over x plus 1. And that is my final answer with the following restriction. That ends our lesson for today. If you have any questions or concerns, please email me or send me a message through Teams, and I will get back and try to help. So have a good day. Thank you.